Okay, so we want to talk about Proverbs and wisdom in general. So I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time going through uh, specific Proverbs or anything like that. But for this second section, so in the first section we kind of had you looking at the structure of Proverbs. And in the second section, I want you to spend some time thinking about how does one teach wisdom? Right? How do you convey wisdom to people? Because it's almost like wisdom breeds more wisdom. If you don't have it, then even what people try and teach you doesn't get retained, right? It almost reminds me of the biblical story where Jesus is teaching, and he says, even what they have will be taken. He's talking about the parable of the talents, and he says, the one who didn't do well, even what he has will be taken from him, right? Who didn't manage it well, and that's really, in many ways, how wisdom is. If you don't use it, and if you don't apply yourself to wisdom, then even what you think you have, you don't really have. But somebody that is trying to grow in wisdom and that appreciates wisdom will see it multiply in their life, right? And so, as teachers, and if you're in this kind of bachelor's program on hermeneutics, there's a good chance that at some point, you'll be called on to teach, and wisdom is one of those ones where it's scattered throughout your messages and throughout your sermons and throughout your teachings, but to speak on just purely wisdom and how to convey wisdom, I think a lot of times wisdom sometimes is caught more than it is taught. That sometimes the stories that we tell, right, as you're teaching or preaching, the illustrations that you use have wisdom layered in them, right? But we know that wisdom in itself, in its pure form, can be taught as well. Otherwise, the Lord wouldn't have given us so many books in the Bible that are just exposition of wisdom, right? In fact, the whole book of Proverbs is just one wise saying right after another. So if God felt that it was appropriate to single out wisdom and to teach on wisdom exclusively for a couple of the books of the Bible, right? Now we get applied wisdom throughout, but we get very specific focus on wisdom in a few of these books. So that tells me then that as teachers, ministers, leaders of our families, whatever, and even in our own personal devotions, that there should be some focus on wisdom in its pure form, right? Okay. So I just want to go through a couple of things here. It comes from the word mashal, right? Mashal, which kind of comes from the similar verb mashal, which is to be like, right? So the content of Proverbs is referred to as mashal, but there is a verb mashal where that word comes from, which means to be like. So it's a little unclear exactly why they call the Proverbs mashal. You can see my little subnote there. They're either trying to show you what you should be like, so to be like. So in other words, setting up as an example of what life should be like. You should live like this. Or it means they're using a comparison to teach. So in other words, there it would be saying wisdom is like this, and so it's a reference to the fact that these proverbs are really using a comparison style, so to speak. That wisdom is like this, and then it explains it in the parable, or in the proverb rather. So either it's a reference. I'll put it this way: either it's a reference to the approach that Proverbs uses as far as its method of teaching. It's showing you what to be like, or it's just more of its structural style is a comparison kind of style. Either way, that could be splitting hairs a little bit, but for your own kind of personal devotion, it's just kind of interesting to know that that proverb really has its root in a verb that means to be like. So another application of that could be, maybe it's to be like God, right? In our limited, finite capacity, that we strive to change ourselves to be more and more in His image. And the application of wisdom is one way that we change, right? To be like Him, right? And so it also brings into focus here the word to be, right? It captures the idea of action, of becoming, right? That wisdom is designed to help us to become something. It's not just to sit back and so that we could teach in a vacuum, or as James says, faith without works. But it's not that. It's something designed to change the person, right? Another interesting thought, it comes right from the very beginning, Proverbs 1:2. And in that, in fact, we talked about that in the other lesson. That was an example that had brought up, was this Proverbs 1 and 2, where it uses the word instruction. And so I was talking about how the parallelism there, if you remember, it was a synonymous parallelism, and it was saying that the sayings of understanding, it compared to wisdom and instruction. And so kind of the neat thing is, though, that this word instruction really, in the English, if you just put the word instruction, it almost gives kind of a false impression. Perhaps a better word that you could use there would be discipline, right? And so it's saying that if you put that word discipline in there, then the synonymous parallelism is saying that understanding is really a combination of wisdom and self-discipline, right? Because it's one thing to know it, it's another thing to do it, right? And I think that's a pretty good understanding of that scripture, to say that when he's using the synonymous parallelism in the second verse that says the sayings of understanding, that what creates an understanding heart is a combination, I believe, of wisdom and then the discipline to act on what you know, right? The growth that comes. Because it's one thing to know what something says, it's another thing to have become it, like we said, the verb to be. And so when we're teaching wisdom to ourselves and to others, it's important to understand this principle here, that discipline is part of it. That part of having an understanding heart emerges from the actions that we do, that we are changed not just by what we learn, but by what we do. And so if we want to teach someone wisdom, we have to keep this in mind, that it cannot be just a theoretical, ideological approach to life, and to think that we will teach them the same way that we would teach them a theory about history or something, a theory of economics. That wisdom in itself is not fully realized in someone's life through just knowledge alone. That wisdom, in order to have its full fruitfulness, is a becoming. It has to do with the type of person that you become, the decisions that you make, and that is a combination of what you know in head knowledge and what you know in experiential knowledge, right? And so this concept of discipline becomes a primary component to teaching wisdom, that we discipline ourselves according to the head knowledge that we have. Paul talks about how he knows what to do, but he finds himself still doing the thing that he knows he shouldn't have done, right? And that is a common experience to mankind, that we could know the right thing, but not have the discipline to do it, and still be fools, and still not be walking in wisdom, because we knew the right thing, but didn't have the self-discipline to become what we had learned in our head. It's easier to read something and to know it conceptually than it is to have become it. And real wisdom is not in knowing, it's in the becoming, right? Because we could all sit back and look at somebody who says, I know you're not supposed to drink and drive, but then they go out and drink and drive and get into a car accident. Their knowing alone did not make them wise, right? It is the knowing combined with the discipline that would have made them wise. If they had had the self-control to do what they knew in their head was right, then they would have been walking in wisdom. So wisdom is this combination of knowledge and discipline, right? Okay, which leads to kind of this third thought, that there is a perceiving wisdom and an acting wisdom, right? And that's really what I've been talking about, is that there is something like the perceiving wisdom would be, you have observed the right way. You know it in your head. You have observed and you perceive that someone should not drink and drive. But then there is an acting wisdom that says, I will not drink and drive, right? And the two have to come together, because if you never perceived it, right, then and you never had the knowledge, the head knowledge, then you may end up doing something in your actions that you didn't even know was wrong, right? And so when you're teaching people, you don't prefer one to the other, right? The acting and the perceiving wisdom, you combine them in your teaching and in your reflections and in your illustrations and in your mentoring and discipleship, right? There's a reason that discipleship is from the root word discipline, right? It is about disciplining yourself to be like the Lord. Was a disciple, someone who became like the Lord. Discipleship, discipline. And in the same way, we are applying wisdom so that we can become like the Lord. And so it is a perceiving and an acting wisdom. Okay, a couple other things. Just something for you to reflect on over this next 2 weeks is, how do we teach and apply wisdom, right? We looked at the structural stuff so that you kind of have a foundation of Proverbs in the first section, but in the second section it might be more conceptual, more thinking, more time and reflection. The first section was probably more of a research component where you're discovering the actual structure. The second one would probably be more of a reflective component where you're asking yourself in your own context, right? Because everybody teaches in a different context. I teach at the university level. Some people teach at church. Some people teach their families. Some people are not teaching in a public arena at this point, and so they are trying to teach themselves and to change themselves. And there's all kinds of combinations of those. And so I would like to see you reflect on, in your context, what does it mean for you to teach and to apply wisdom, right? And how do you model it, and how do you present it so that the people will embrace it, right? Because you have to keep in mind both aspects, the doing part and the perceiving part, right? And so often in our teaching, if we're not careful, we emphasize the knowing apart from the doing, right? And so maybe one way is that in your examples and in your applications, you bring in actual things that someone could do to model whatever principle of wisdom you're trying to teach at the moment. So you don't just teach them the principle, but you show them in real life action examples of someone modeling that behavior. Sometimes it's much easier for people to translate a wisdom principle into action if they have examples of someone else who has translated that principle into action. If in your teaching, if you just leave it at the conceptual level, you just give them the principle itself, they don't necessarily have the framework and the nimbleness of thought in the moment to come up with their own examples. So it's always important, if you're going to teach a conceptual wisdom principle, to give them 2 or 3 real life examples of what that means. Then all of a sudden their brain processes the doing part alongside the principle part. Okay, and so, and I'm sure there's some other thoughts that you can come up with yourself about how do you convey wisdom, right? The next one, the Bible tends to compare and contrast between how things are and how they should be. So this is important, that if the Bible uses this compare and contrast, that would be a good method for us to use as well. That maybe in some of our teaching, we use case studies, for example, and you say, well, such and such did this. Now let's, as neutral observers, let's talk about what they could have done differently, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be even a real thing, right? Jesus used parables and things of that nature. So as a teacher, maybe you come up with some scenario and give your people an opportunity to interact with the scenario that you created and to talk about it and to discuss what they would have done. Because in the discussion of wisdom, often people have a buy-in, right? If it's their own ideas and those types of things, and once they've kind of start discussing it, they're speaking it with their own mouth, there tends to be more of a openness to change in their life when they've had a chance to discuss wisdom. And so that's something interesting. But the compare and contrast model is in there quite a bit. You've seen this, but really it's this. And you may think this, but actually it should be this. And so that comparison and contrasting model, I think there's some truth to that helps us to see that we learn just as much by knowing what we should do. We can learn almost just as much by learning what we shouldn't have done too. So there's both elements to that. It's not one or the other, but it's both. So for instance, in marketing, I would teach to not only show the benefits of using your product, but also talk about the consequences of not using the product. And they're two totally different streams of thought. So it's not that you want one over the other, you want to include both. And it's the same principle here, that you want to talk about how wisdom should look, but then you also want to talk about what wisdom doesn't look like. And that compare and contrast model of teaching will help people to put it into a better framework of understanding. All right, the next one. The Bible also teaches that wisdom is a choice and an understanding, right? So if we're going back to this thought that wisdom is not just conceptual, that it is an action, then that also implies that wisdom is a choice, right? That once the knowledge is there, that true wisdom is a choice, right? So that's an important thing to remember, because sometimes people are foolish, and that's a choice as well, right? That it's not just a reflection of how much they've learned, right? Because what we want to do sometimes, we want to assume, okay, this person is foolish because they just haven't learned how to be wise. But it's not always the case. They may have known better and are choosing to still be foolish, right? And so as a teacher, you may bang your head up against a wall, or a parent or a family member or a loved one, trying to get them to change, and you're trying to teach them all of these things, and you're thinking, why don't they just get it? And in many times they do get it, but they have not chosen to be wise, right? And so that's an important thing to remember, that wisdom is a choice. That we can only take people so far. We can fill them with understanding. We can help them to see it. We can paint the picture for them. We can give them opportunities to discuss it and to talk about it. But when it comes right down to it, it is still a choice. So wisdom is not a knowledge per se. Wisdom is also a choice. It includes knowledge. It includes understanding. But it also includes a choice. Which brings me to the last one. We must teach the fear of the Lord, right? This is where the choice part is influenced the most, right? That when there is a fear of the Lord, someone wants to do, right? Do, become, act on, put action to their wisdom, because there's a fear of the Lord, right? And so where there is no fear of the Lord, the pressure to choose correctly is not as strong. Anytime someone is aware of the Lord and aware that the Lord is watching them and aware that the Lord wants them to do right and that the Lord is mighty and He holds their future in His hand, and He is loving and He's gracious, and there's something about that knowledge, that respect of the Lord, that puts a pressure on you to want to do right. And it's a good pressure, right, that leads us to wisdom. And in absence of that pressure, men often go on all kinds of tangents, and their wisdom is turned into foolishness. And so this is why, if we really want someone to be wise, sometimes it's not so much teaching them the specific wisdom that you want them to have. Sometimes it is a reinforcement of the fear of the Lord. And so we teach on the majesty of God and the wonder of God. And out of those teachings, often you will see wisdom come out in all kinds of areas, because the moment that somebody kind of gets this part, where they begin to reverence the Lord, it has impact on, it begins to bring to life, if you will, all of the areas where they had head knowledge only, and they didn't have the action part, right? They knew to do right, but they didn't have the discipline to do it. Sometimes the fear of the Lord creates a situation where things that are head knowledge start becoming reality in someone's life. They've known they should have done better for a long time, and when they begin to reverence the Lord, what they've already known begins to come into action in their life, right? So I guess the main principles from this lesson is that it as the Bible teaches, it does begin with fear of the Lord, right? And so we want to have them be aware of the principles, right? But we are also fully aware of the fact that the principle alone is not true wisdom, that it is the principle and the choice to do that combine together to form true wisdom. And so we teach and we instruct so that people will have the principle, but then we also need to reinforce the fear of the Lord, the reverence of God, so that there is the atmosphere that is conducive to them choosing correctly and choosing to be obedient to what they have learned. And the combination of all of that helps lead people in the right direction. Okay.